The thick, slimy mud of the Thames ran through and between his bare feet. It was a feeling that he knew very well, for he was a man who had worked a long time by the side of the cool, clear Thames. But without shoes on his feet, the mud would run between his toes and lie on his legs, and sometimes he was very pleased to know that there were hairs on his leg that would keep some kind of warmth from his bones. An old man, and he knew it, and he wasn't ashamed to say that he was old. He'd lived a good long life here, working hard at taking all of the paper from off the boats and delivering it to the printers. The long, winding, narrow streets of London were no challenge to him. He knew his way from one place to another. But when no one was looking, he would reach and take a piece of paper for himself. It wasn't as if he could read or write, but he would scratch at a piece of paper and make a diary of the things that he had seen and done, but not with words, but with pictures. Lifting all of the paper had made him strong, and he loved to swim in the cool, calm, clear water of the Thames. And when he would pull his strong fingers through his hair, it would make his hair stand up from the top of his head. He was a brave man, but he'd never really had that much chance to show just how brave he was. And now he was half asleep, even though it was the tail end of a day in September. It was a hot day, and you couldn't really tell whether he was smiling or not, for his lips were straight. But he looked out, and he knew that he'd done a good day's work. And now it was time for him to go home from the side of the cold quay. He walked the way that he would always walk, but he loved the way that the paper felt inside of his dirty shirt. It was ripped and it was torn, but it was the best shirt that he had, and he would keep the paper inside of his shirt so that he could make his diary of pictures. He was always very worried in case the paper would get dirty. He would make his marks on it, but he would brush it clean to make sure that he could draw what he'd seen and what he'd done. Every day he would keep a page, and another page would be kept with another, and now it was a sizable diary, and it was his most precious possession in all of this world. But now, as he was making his way back towards his poor home, he saw something sticking out of the mud. He could tell that it was bright, and on any other day he would have picked it up, but this time, as he stopped to look at it, he could smell smoke in the air, for it had been a long day. Smoke in the air, not just from the ordinary fires inside of the houses, but a choking smoke. And he could hear people screaming, yelling and shouting as he was making his way home. And without thinking, he reached down and picked up this pretty bracelet. It was silver and bright, and he would have knocked on everybody's doors, but now the shouting became louder, and people were throwing things to other hands to catch their most precious possessions were being thrown, and so that they could take them away from the fire that was now devouring the whole of London. It had been a long, dry summer, and the wind was blowing the flames higher and higher. Some were standing and looking and watching, but others were trying to get away from that place. But he picked up the bracelet, and the only thing that he could think of doing was to wrap it about his own wrist. He was quite happy because he had all of his diary in his pack at his back, and now he was running. Some of these people who were throwing the things into the street and placing them inside of the great St. Paul's Cathedral because they didn't think that that would ever get burned down. He didn't wait. He started to run, and he was wondering if he would ever get a chance to swim in the Thames again. But it was when he stopped, far away from the flames, as the day was starting to dawn again, that he could see the thick cloud of smoke that lay over the top of London. And he knew that this was something that he needed to draw about. As he put the bracelet on his wrist, as he was trying to draw his pictures, it slipped down, and instead of there being drawings there, he could see that there were words. There was something magical about this bracelet that he'd found. the one that had brushed against his feet that he'd seen in the street as the flames had grown higher. And there he looked, and instead of drawing pictures, he was writing words, and he could read them. He thought that this was the strangest thing in all of this world. But he went through all of the pictures that he'd drawn, and at the bottom he'd always left a small space, and now he was writing words. Inside of this bracelet he could write. Or he wrote. He could not stop himself from writing. Day after day he would write, and people would want to read the stories of the things that he'd done and look at the pictures of what he had drawn before he had magically been able to learn to read and write. Now, many years later, when age was at his back even more, he would stand there and hold his stick. It was a beautifully cut and carved stick, and he would look at people walking past him, and he would never tell them that he was the one who had written and drawn the book. But they would be reading in the street. They couldn't stop themselves from reading of the things that he'd done and the life that he'd led by the side of the cold quay. But he didn't have to live there now. For by the magic of that bracelet, which he still held at his wrist, he could write. He didn't need to write inside of it. He would hold a long pencil and he would write stories. Stories that people wanted to read. Well, everyone knew that the rich people had written diaries, kings had written their diaries, historians had written stories, but he had written about ordinary people who lived in London at that time. But he still wasn't satisfied. As he rested on his stick, he thought that he would go back to the new houses that lay in place of the ones that had burnt down. And he said, "Well, boy, you cannot read, you cannot write. Sit here now." And he would take the pencil from out of his hand and he would give it to the boy and show them how to draw, show them how to write. He would give them a chance to draw round shapes, and girls and boys would come to that place, and he would rest easy, smiling as he watched the sun go down on the new London that had been built since the Great Fire. And he knew that the gift that he had been given, not just to read and to write, but the true magic was the fact that he had taught others to read and write. And there he would look as the sun would flicker on the River Thames, and he would know what it was to be happy. Now, brave and friendly he might have been, but I've got to tell you, his master at the bakery thought that he was nothing better than a fool, for that was all he wanted to do, to make other people laugh and joke. And now this boy had long grey hair and a huge coat on his back, which didn't belong to him. In fact, they belonged to the master baker, and he placed the master baker's wig upon his head, and now he was dancing around and throwing his arms to make the other apprentice bakers laugh. Well, it might have been quite funny, but inside a bakery it is hot and the ovens can burn, and as he raised his arm up, he burnt the cuff of his master's coat that he could never have paid for in 100 lifetimes. But here he was, trying to make the other boys laugh, dancing around. Now, he wasn't really a fool, because he could read, not very well, not as if he'd ever been to school, but he could read cookery books well enough to make sure that he would make fine foods that would lay upon people's tongue. And this was the way, as he was dancing around, screaming and yelling, and the other boys were laughing as his bare feet clattered on the dusty and flower-covered ground, the master returned. He didn't scream. He didn't yell. He didn't bawl or howl or holler. He just stood there and watched his best coat being burned on the side of the oven. He watched his wig being filled with flour And it was as the boy started to imitate the baker's voice that finally the baker snapped. "You, sir, are nothing more than a fool. Come here!" But the boy was quick. He was strong enough. He was strong even on his bare feet on the slippery, flowered ground. But he ran, and the baker, he looked and thought, there is no way that I will catch that fool of a boy by running after him. And here he reached towards a book, a scary-looking, leather-bound book with faded pages, in amongst all of his cookery books. That baker took the book and he flung it through the air, and it was almost as if the way that the pages went, that it started to fly through the air, and the boy was expecting it to strike him on the back of his head, when it was there and fluttered in the air like a seagull or a crow or a parrot as it landed upon his shoulder. He laughed to himself. He knew that he'd better take off his master's coat and his master's wig. But he looked through the pages, and even he could not understand what these strange writings were, for they didn't seem to make much sense to him. But the idea of sitting down and reading one of his master's books, especially now outside in the good cold air. So he sat, and he pulled up an old piece of cloth, an old piece of sacking that the flour and the grain had come into the bakery, and he sat upon it. And he started to read. Now, without understanding what the words meant, he was speaking them out loud. And it was then that he found himself, just like the book, raising himself up into the air and swooping this way and that. He was frightened, more frightened than he had ever been in all of his life. But the thrill was there, and the pages in the book flapped about, and he looked around, and it was as he looked down he could see the chimneys in all of London town. He could look and he could see that there was a fire over here, and there was another chimney with its smoke pluming out and up into the air, and he looked and he saw that there was a house on fire over there by the side of the house on fire by the side of the river. He swooped down and saw that it was coming closer and closer towards his master's house. Now he knew that his master would not be very pleased to see him return after having spoiled his coat and dusted up his wig. But he was there, and he banged on the door. "Please let me in, let me in. These sorcerer's words have let me see that there is a great fire and that it's coming closer." The other boys knew that there had been many fires inside of London. Some of them hadn't been born that long before 1642, when there was a huge fire, and there was another fire in 1658, and another in 1661, and now it looked as if there was going to be a huge fire on this September's night in 1666. One by one, his friends, who were very brave indeed, decided that they would get on to the great wad of sacking, and they would fly away and out of the country. He could only take them in ones and twos, and it was when that the master baker could smell the burning in the air that he too relented and said that he would like to have some help from this very good boy that he's always liked all through the time that he'd worked for him. And the two of them flew. The master's weight was almost too much for the sacking, even with magic woven within its threads. But he took them out to the countryside, where each and every one of all of those apprentices stood and wondered what it was they were going to do. But when there is a great fire and there is no bread to eat, then other food needs to be made and found, and flour, and that was just what they did. Or they didn't have a bakery, but they could cook the bread by open fires and make sure that all of the people who had been dispossessed and displaced by the fire could find some food to eat. The master hadn't left the bakery empty-handed. He had also brought with him his favourite cookery books, which the boy read and used. And the master said, You may have been foolish, but you were certainly the bravest of all of the apprentices that I have ever had. And I would wish you to have this." And here he handed over his favourite cookery book to the apprentice. He didn't cast the master out. He didn't send the other apprentices away. They worked as if they were of one family, and people would travel from the north and the south, from the east and from the west, to come and taste the finest bread that had ever been tasted in all of this life. And if people were to ask how they had travelled from the middle of town to the outskirts of London, he would smile to himself and say, "Oh, it was upon the wings of a book, a good book, a book that I still cannot read." But everyone thought that was just a foolish thing to say, as they would eat the best bread in all of England. Even though there was no music, she would still dance. This girl loved to dance, and she loved the way that her long straight hair would flow over her shoulders. She had a beautiful dress on her back, and there was a thin red-lipped smile on her face. And I'll tell you this, she was kind and she was brave and she was generous. There was one thing that always brought a smile to her face, and that was to dig in the garden, to plant flowers, to cut flowers. And now, in her small hands behind her back, she had a bunch of purple flowers. She was going to give them to the boy who lived in the house next to theirs. Their house was a purple timbered house. It could not be missed. Everyone would see it. And she loved the colour purple, and now she had these purple flowers, and she was going to give them to the boy. Now, he was an unkind boy. He didn't care what he said, and she thought, in all of her generosity, if she was to give him the posy of flowers, then it might make him happy. It might make him smile. It might make him stop being so unkind. As she was walking towards him, she could see that there was an old man, a strong old man, who was obviously poor, for he didn't have fine clothes on his back. She had boots on her feet, high laced boots. But the old man, as he came close, the unkind boy put his small hand into a hard fist and said, "Get away! We don't want you round here. You don't deserve to be in this place. This is our part of town." The girl could not believe it. If she'd been smiling before, then her lips were straight now. And instead of giving the flowers to the boy, she gave them to the old man. The old man was very grateful. "Thank you kindly for that. That was a good thing for you to do. I'm going to give you something." Here, he reached inside of his pocket and he held out his hand and said to her, "Cup your hands together and I'll give you something here." She held out her hands like this, and the old man had his hand above hers, and he opened up his hand, and a coin did not fall. It was almost as if it flew into her hand. It was very strange and old and cold and made of gold. "That coin'll help you tonight. It'll keep you safe. And thanks for your kindness." The girl thought it was very strange, but she held onto the coin and placed it into the purse that she held at the belt at her waist. But that night, there was smoke in the air. There was fire and flames and sparks that seemed to go everywhere. And everywhere they landed, a new fire started. It had been a dry summer and the wind was blowing. And it was then, as she thought that the house would be burned down and the garden and the flowers would be gone forever, she remembered what the old man had said. She took the coin from out of her purse, she held it in her hand, and she called to her mother and father. The three of them held hands, hugged each other, and stood there, and as the flames came closer, it was as if the coin protected them from the flames. It came close to the house, but they knew they couldn't stay in this place. And it was, as they walked along, she was holding the coin in her hands, that the flames would not come close to them. They went to the far part of the town. A beautiful dress with the flowers at the sleeves was now dirty and scorched, but they were safe. And after many weeks, they decided to go back into the town to see what was left of their house. But I tell you something, they could not believe it, because as they got close, they could see that every other house was ash and rubble, but their purple house that everyone could have seen before the fire was still there. Their house was safe. The boy, the unkind boy, was never seen. But when she looked on the grass, she looked and she saw that there was a small posy of flowers. And beside the posy of flowers there was a coin that was old and cold and made of gold. She knew that the old man had given her something magical and mystical that had protected them from the fire. And she would always keep those 2 coins on a chain about her neck. And when she was a woman, she would sit and she would say how an old man who was poor but strong had saved her family, her house, her garden, and the flowers from the great fire of London. For anyone else, the smell of fish would have been unbearable, but not to this boy. He loved to eat fish and he loved to go fishing. And if he had a chance, he would have liked to have worked on the stall that sold the fish. But he didn't have the chance and he didn't have the choice. He was a barrow boy and he would have to work selling vegetables. Now, in this walled market where it was very busy and noisy, he would stay there until there were no more vegetables left on his stall. And if that meant that he stayed there until the wee small hours, then he would stay there until the wee small hours. He dreamt of a time when he could be lazy and not have to keep on working. But he was generous in his spirit. And if people were asking him for things that he did not have on his stall, then he would lead them to other people. And he didn't realise it, but there were many eyes that would watch him and smile and think about, even though that he had so little, he would be generous in his spirit. Now, he looked around him. His eyes that were usually so bright were now starting to get heavy, and his lips were unsmiling because he'd been there all day, standing, shouting, and trying to make sure that his voice was heard above everyone else's, here in the heart of London town. He could see that there was a woman, an old woman, who was looking at him from the edge of the market, and it made him feel just a little bit uncomfortable. He would pull his hands up to his face, and he would glance over towards her to see if she was still looking at him, but every time he looked at her, she would look away. There were lots of rich people who would come to this place, some to laugh at the common people, and there were servants who would be buying for them. Oh, they would make sure that they didn't get their hands dirty. They would get the servants to pick up the food. And still he wished that he could have worked on the fish stall. Now, all of the houses were close together here in this place, but the market was quite a big space. It had been here for hundreds of years, and who was to know that it wouldn't still be there in hundreds of years to come? But he stood there in his dirty shirt and dreamt and thought and wished for fish. Well, As he looked around, he couldn't believe it, but he saw something that had fallen out of the old woman's pocket. And he looked, and he wasn't going to wait for a second. He said, "You've dropped something. You've dropped that. This belongs to you." Now, he did try and give it to her, but the old woman made it clear that she didn't want it. "No, I think you're wrong. It doesn't belong to me." This time she did look him in the eyes. "It does not belong to me." The boy looked and saw that it was a pack of cards, brightly coloured. He'd seen his father and his brothers all playing cards, but he'd never been given the chance. And to have a pack of cards for himself, well, he had tried his best. He had tried to give them back to the old woman. But he looked and he thought, "I've only got a few more vegetables to sell, and hopefully I'll be able to go to bed." But he clutched onto that pack of cards as if it were a king's ransom, a king's treasure. And now there was a smile on his lips. Standing on the cobbles with bare feet all day had made his back sore, and now he thought that he would make his way home, now that the barrow was so empty. But there was a glow in the night. There were huge, long, crackling sparks in the air. "Some fools let the chimney catch on fire," he said to himself, because it wasn't that unusual. There had been fires in London for years. Well, what could you expect? All of the houses were close together. All of the houses nearly touched. But this was different. It wasn't just the fact that there was smoke in the air and a glow in the night. It was the fact that the air was warm. He looked about him. He knocked at his pocket and he thought of the cards. He wondered what he could do with the cards, and perhaps it was just the fact that it was so dark, or perhaps it was the fact that he was so tired. But he rubbed at his bright eyes and he looked at the cards, and instead of numbers, not that he could count, and instead of shapes, not that he knew what they were, you could see that there were arrows. He shuffled the cards, he shuffled them, opened it up, and an arrow would point this way and that. And I don't know whether it was just curiosity, but it was as if the cards were directing him. For now the streets were getting crowded with people who were wanting to watch the fire. Oh, it was a big fire, a huge fire. They were looking and watching and thinking, this would be a good night's sport and entertainment. But the boy had seen fires before, and there was a greater curiosity. The fact that the cards were leading him along the road. Shuffled them, and an arrow would lead this way. Now in his heart, he knew that that was the wrong way to go, because that wouldn't take him home. But perhaps it was by the fact that he followed the arrows as they came up on the pack of cards, that he found himself by a part of the Thames that he'd never ever seen before. He looked and he thought and he wondered. An opportunity too good to miss. He started to fish. He fished in that place. And all around him the fire burned. And he wondered, when it was so cold that he couldn't fish anymore, he thought that the fire perhaps had gone. But he couldn't find his way back. He didn't know which way to go. And then he remembered the cards. So he started to shuffle them again. And yet again, they led him. They led him down alleyways, in between houses and places and churches that he'd never been before, by the side of parks. And it was then that he realised that he was being led back towards the market. He could see it. The stench of smoke in the air was almost unbearable. But he was being led back to his place of work. Well, this is a good thing, thought the boy, to be taken back to work before I even need to be there. But the market was wide and walled. And in the middle of the market, the fire burned all around. It became so hot that he had to remove the shirt from off his back and hope that the flames would go. But they did. And he, standing there alone in the middle of the market, he was safe. For there was nothing there to burn. All of the stalls had gone, all of the food had been swept up, the barrows were gone, and there was nothing to burn. He could see a few singes on his clothes, but it was almost as if that pack of cards had led him away from the fire and almost back towards the heart of the fire, where he could find some shelter in the walled marketplace. It was a long time before he ever did learn how to play cards, and sometimes he would have to rub at his eyes to look and make sure that there were numbers and symbols on the cards and not arrows that would lead him to safety. You would think that with a long dirty hair that you would not have been allowed to go anywhere near anything that people would eat. But that was where she worked. She worked in the bakery. Her long thin arms would pull at the bread and the dough and mould it into the shapes of bread. But her hair was long and black and thick and dirty, because what she loved to do in her spare time was go down by the side of the River Thames, and when the waters had receded, she would be there like a mudlark, pushing and pulling her way, slurping through all of the thick, greasy mud to see what she could find. Now, she was an unkind girl. There was no doubt about that, because that was just the way that she was. In her spare time, she would say, "In my spare time, I work in the bakery." She was not far from the middle of town, and I've got to tell you that as soon as she would finish her work, she would go out and she would pull her fingers through all of the mud to see what she could find. Things that had been cast off from the boats, things that had fallen from the sides of the quayside. And that was why she never wore anything on her legs. She had a dress that had once been long and had belonged to somebody else, but now it was ragged and short. She thought it was a good thing to have thin arms, because then she could pull through the mud the quicker and the faster and find all of the things that she wanted. She would look around, she would sneer at anybody that came close to her, because she decided that she was going to take everything that she could and keep it for herself, because that's the way that she was. And it wasn't just restricted to being down by the side of the River Thames, because she would take things when she thought no one was looking. She would take things from out of the bakery. Well, mostly they used the oven. They would use long spatulas of wood to push the bread further into the oven and pull them out. And she had scalds and burns on her arms, but all she was thinking about was taking the rusty pan. The rusty pan that she could see that no one had used, so it wasn't really taking it. It was a case of helping them by making some space inside of the bakery. Well, as she looked out through a cracked wooden window at the side of the bakery, she could see that there was a light in the air. Now, she knew that she had worked a long time, but she hadn't walked all of the way through to dawn, because she'd walked that way many times, and now she had worked and there was a bright glow in the air, and she decided that she would go out and see what she could see, even though she hadn't finished all of her work. When she went outside, she could smell smoke. It was not thick and heavy in the air, but there amongst all of the other bakers, above the smell of the yeast and the bread, there was the smell of broken and burnt wood. And she could see that there was a man, an old man that she'd always been frightened of, but there, through that broken window, as she walked past it, she could see him gathering up all of his papers, all of his boxes, and he was taking them and putting them onto a cart outside. But when he put them outside onto the cart, a wooden box with huge iron hinges fell down on the ground and spilt everything out of it. Now, on the top of all of these things, she could see his mark to make sure that he knew that the things were his. And she reached down, and she didn't mean anything more than to pick it up and put it back inside of the box. But as she reached down, she picked up what looked like a pencil. It was longer than any pencil she'd ever seen, and she waved it above her head. Oh, let's just see what this can do. Well, she'd always been unkind, and that man was an alchemist, an apothecary, a dabbler in magic. And that was no pencil that she had picked up, but it was a wand that had broken. And she had only thought of bad things that she could turn to. But with waving it above her head, and broken as it was, it changed the way that she was. The man had fearful looking eyes. He was coming closer to her. "What do you think you're doing, you stupid girl? Give me that!" And here he snatched his wand from out of her hand. And she laughed to herself, because as he grabbed hold of it and picked it up, it snapped and broke into 2 pieces upon the ground. Now he was pushing all of his goods into the cart, but he was old and thin, and he had never had to do anything in a hurry in his life, or had to do anything that required him to do work. And he was pushing at that barrow as hard as he could towards the wooden bridge. But when there is a fire, the last place that you should head for is something that is made out of wood. The girl could see. She could see that he was heading towards a broken bridge that had been scorched by the fire's flames and would not bear his or all of his things' weight. She would never have helped him in the past, but with waving the stick above her head, it had changed the way that she was. And she ran. She ran where she could see the horse's hoof prints in the mud. She ran towards that man, and he was struggling to pull all of his goods from off the side of the broken bridge. But she didn't wait. She picked him up. She knew that it was better to save his life than to save all of his things, all of his inks, his pens, his paintbrushes. And I've got to tell you, she looked. There was something about the paintbrushes, for they had his mark on them. And she had found those things in the mud by the side of the Thames. He wasn't grateful. She'd put him upon her back. She'd dragged him out of the mud. She'd saved his life, and never a word of thank you passed his lips. But she wondered. She wondered that if a stick could hold magic, then the other things that she'd found in the mud of the Thames might also hold magic inside of them. Some people were surprised. Some people were shocked by the way that she had changed, for she helped everyone that she could as the fire started to consume the heart and soul of London town. They knew her. They thought that she would be only trying to do bad things. But she smiled to herself. And it was the way that she was for the rest of her life. For out of all of the ashes of the fire of London, she had emerged like a phoenix, as someone who was kind, someone who was good, someone who could make bread, and someone who had magic at her fingertips. My name is Tony Wilson, and what I'm going to try and show you is how to plot and plan a story in a short space of time. I'm not saying that this is the only way that you can plot and plan a story, but it's something that I've used when I was a teacher, and it does work. Quite often, it's the fact that there is a blank sheet of paper that tends to put children off, that they've no idea what it is to put in the story. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do this in 2 parts. If you look at the other DVD that I have on YouTube, which is called A Practical Guide to Creative Writing, it explains about answering the 5 W's and use of adjectives and a lot of other things beside. What we're going to do is we're going to look at a story, but first of all, let's give ourselves a character. So what you can do is you put a drawing of the character in the middle here. If nothing else, this reinforces what the character is going to look like, and it establishes a lot of things about the character, because you'll find that sometimes children may not understand that in the Great Fire of London children didn't wear hoodies and t-shirts. So it gives you a chance to work as a class to describe a character that you're going to have in your story. And on this side you'll put all of the external characteristics. And you might as well at this early stage start putting some kind of rules in, say that you can only use an adjective once, because otherwise it winds up being big, 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 and long, 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 and not all colour. Okay, so it's use of adjectives, and it's also about the internal characteristics of this person. But let's do the external first. Since I don't have a class here, you'll just have to put up with me making up a story. And since the current topic of the class that I'm working with at this moment is about the Great Fire of London, then we'll do a boy. Okay, so from the top of the head to the tips of the toes, and at this side, in the same place as you have the drawing, you'll write the words that describe them. Because what happens is, this is a usable plan for a story, because you've divided it into 3, and the children can look at it as they use it. Because if they've done it on a sheet of A4 paper with those folds in, then it can stand on their tables and they can use it. And on the other side, when we come to the second part of this, they can use the other side. So as they are writing, they have their vocabulary and dictionary in front of them. I've got to tell you about this, that the only thing that changes with this, right from using it with reception and very young children, right up to using it with year 10s, is that it's the vocabulary that you actually use and the detail that goes into it. So, let's draw a picture of a boy. So we'll say that he had short hair. So, short hair. He had bright eyes. So if I write on here, short. I don't need to write everything on here, just the words that will help me, because that's the other thing that happens with a plan, that it winds up being the story written out and then written out again. Well, this is purely and simply a series of words. So short, and we'll say straight. Short, straight hair. And if you look, you can see that short and straight are written beside his hair. He's got bright eyes. And he's going to have an ordinary shaped nose, not the way that a lot of children do, where they're obsessed with the idea of it being a foot long. We'll give him a straight mouth, so we've no idea whether he's happy or sad. Okay, there's this boy. So, we've already used straight, so we'll put in unsmiling. There's no reason why we have to use over and over and over again the same words. That's the beauty of the English language, of any language, that you use as many as you possibly can. So short, straight hair, bright eyes, unsmiling mouth. He's going to be wearing a ragged shirt. Now it's not going to have buttons, it would be tied probably with a lace, because here if you think about the 17th century, let's make it so that's straight down, almost like a kind of a smock. This is, so it's going to be a dirty, I'm going to say a dirty shirt. And he's going to have strong hands. I'm doing this really quickly. You would be questioning the children all of the time. Dirty shirt, strong hands. So 1, 2, 5. Here he is with these strong hands. Even with these few characteristics, you're starting to think about how are we going to say about this boy. He's got a dirty shirt. So we must do something that's putting the dirt onto his clothes. He's got strong hands, so he'll be involved with some kind of work. Okay, you would have trousers, but let's say that the trousers that have once been long, but now they're ragged and they're being torn. Got that? Yeah. So ragged and torn trousers at the same place as the, and he's going to have, let's say, bare feet. Okay, so here we go, it's only bare feet, like this. You're going to feel better about your own drawing once you've seen this, okay? And bare feet. In a short space of time, through questioning, you can get a character to go into your story. Short hair, bright eyes, unsmiling mouth, dirty shirt, strong hands, ragged torn trousers, and bare feet. But that's quite good if it's only the external characteristics. But one of the things that you can do, especially with older children, is introduce the internal characteristics of this character. Okay? So let's say that he would be lazy if he had the chance. We could say that he was generous, but he's got nothing. Again, this would all be developed through questioning. What kind of a boy is he? What is he wearing? What do his clothes look like? What kind of a person is he, and why is he in that place? So here we say that he's lazy, that he's generous, but he doesn't have anything. Okay? What else? Well, that's a positive characteristic, and this one's a negative characteristic. So it depends on how the children generate this person. Remember, they're not trying to rewrite a soap or make it so that it's a High School Musical, The Great Fire of London years. So here he is, lazy, generous, likes to dance. Something that you wouldn't be able to see on the outside and you wouldn't expect. What kind of food does he like? He likes to eat fish. Okay? And how does he get the fish? Because he likes to go fishing. Remember, this doesn't have to be a reworking of Shakespeare. Top and bottom of it is, you're trying to generate a character in a short space of time, not too many notes, but notes that can be used. So here's lazy, generous, likes to dance, likes eating fish, likes going fishing. What kind of work does he do? Okay, well, I mean, it could go down the obvious route with the Great Fire of London and say that he was a baker's assistant. But let's say he carries things or he transports things. So we're going to say that he's like a costermonger, a barrow boy. Sorry, yes. So a barrow boy, and he sells. Well, let's say he would like to sell fish, but he has to sell vegetables. Vegetables that are being grown outside of the great city of London. So here you have this character, all right? And instead of saying, there was a boy, we now have, he stood there by the edge of the market, and he pulled his hands through his short straight hair and looked all around him. His eyes were bright and open, but he was not smiling. If he'd had the chance, he would have been a lazy boy who would not have worked. But with his strong hands, he would work in the market, picking up all of the vegetables. He had to put them on the barrow to sell for all of the people who had more money than he would ever have had in all of his life. What he really wanted to do was go fishing. He loved the fact that he could just sit by the side of the cool, calm, clear Thames and catch fish that he would eat. In and around the market, he could see the other boys, the boys who worked on the fish stall. And really, that was why he couldn't bring himself to smile. He had to pull his hands through all of the different vegetables, the carrots, the potatoes, when really he would have loved to have held silver fish in his hands. The sun might have been bright, but the ground was cold on his feet, his bare feet, as he stood there in the crowded marketplace. All right, so here we are in the second part of this plotting and planning for a SAT story. One of the requirements is that there is something magical found, something magical that can change the character or the setting or the place that they are. Well, if you think about it, when we made the character of the boy, we said that he was in a market. So we're going to start it in the market. And I would say to the children, what can you see, what can you hear in that market? Well, let's say it's going to be busy, and it's going to be pretty smelly. Yeah. What else is going to be in that place? Well, it's going to be busy. There's going to be a lot of noise. People shouting. Okay, shouting. Now, if we're going to make it the Great Fire of London, it could be before the fire, as the fire is about to break out, the day after the fire, or a week after the fire. There's no reason why it has to be at the very instant that Pudding Lane burns down. So just off the top of my head, we'll say that this was the afternoon going into the night time of the day that the Great Fire of London broke out. Because if you think about it, in the 17th century, people would be selling their wares until they had none left. They wouldn't say, well, it's 5 o'clock or 5:30, we need to close now. Okay? And through discussion and through your own knowledge of the subject, you can develop what the children understand about what happened in the mid to late 17th century. Okay, so here we have it. It's a market, it's a busy place, it's smelly, there's a lot of noise, there's people shouting, desperate to get their wares sold. What else would it be? Would it be walled? Would it be open, cobbled, flat? Well, we'll say that there were cobbles because this was a very prestigious market. But there was a smell of rotting vegetables, so that there was rot in the air. What else was it like, and what could you see? Well, let's say like rich people and servants coming to buy things, and the houses close together. Because with any story, what you're trying to do is, you're trying to set a scene. So here we've got the beginning of the story, here we've got the middle of the story, and here we've got the ending of the story. If you think about this boy, one of the things that was said was that he was lazy and he liked to fish, but he hardly ever got a chance to do that. So could we make something from this place, and he was poor? Well, perhaps that's a way to start, from being poor, as he was in the character, to being rich. So that's what's going to happen. Something here in the middle of this story is going to find that has magical and mystical properties that's going to turn him to be rich. That's what you do. You focus on something. It could be that lazy, he becomes hard-working. So we're going to say that the change is going to be rich. All right. So we'll say that he finds an object. Well, if you look on my DVD, A Practical Guide to Creative Writing, it shows you about making bag stories, or stories out of bags, and I'll just choose something. This is the first thing that's on here. It's a box. It's a series of cards that are used in mathematics. This is going to be what he finds, something that gets dropped out of somebody's pocket that he can pick up. Okay? We said that there are rich people in this place, so we're going to say these. So again, you would show it to the children, you would say, what could this be? What could its magical properties be? But we're going to say these cards. Cards. Perhaps with him being young, he wouldn't be able to read or write. So we're going to say cards, he doesn't know what they are. Doesn't know. He doesn't know what they are. He's going to try and give them back. Because we might have said that he was lazy, but there's no reason for him to be a thief. Try and give them back. No one wants them. I always think it's a good idea to make sure you don't have too many characters, but we'll say that they fell from a woman's, an old woman's pocket. And what it is, she doesn't want them. But she does want to help the boy. Honestly, I haven't pre-prepared this. This was a blank sheet of paper. I didn't know there were going to be cards there. It's practice that makes this work. Okay. She doesn't want them. She looks at him. And he tries to give them. So you can always draw an arrow between the two. She looks at him and refuses to take them back, but smiles. Because she's trying to help him. Okay? What is it that these cards are going to do? A great fire, there could be, I'm going to say from the top of my head, I would say that because he can't read, he'll be able to recognise places that he needs to go. So it could be like a pack of cards that have arrows, and it's like a map. So it's like a map, arrows, cards, with directions on. And it's going to be that he follows them out of curiosity. Follows them out of curiosity, and it leads him to safety. Do you know something? You've got to think about the way that the Great Fire of London spread, and it would be too easy to say, and then he found himself out in the middle of the countryside, and there was the old lady. Let's make it so that we use this market again. If it was walled and broad, it could lead him right back to the middle of the market, where he would find himself surrounded by fire, but safe. Market, fire, safe. And there we've got, in a short space of time, something that happens. These cards, we're not going to make them glow, that's a little bit kind of cliched, but we've got it so that he starts in the market, he finds these magical cards, and he gets led to safety. And I would say that that is a pretty good story, plot and plan. There is not a lot there. And if the children have done this, so on one side they have the character, and on the other side they have the actual plot, well, what can happen is, how fortuitous is that? I've made myself a table. They can do it like that, character on one side, and turn it around like that, to look for the setting, and keep turning it around, and turning it around. And it stands in front of them, and even in their trays, it falls small and flat, so it doesn't get scrumpled up and ruined. I'll tell the story in the next session.